My husband handed me a $40 million lie and asked me to smile while he told a room full of investors that I never read anything before I signed it. 15 years of marriage, and Derek still thought I'd forgotten everything I used to know. He built the Whitfield Group on my silence the way other men build companies on capital. What he never counted on was that the woman he'd spent over a decade turning into a decorator and a hostess had once been a licensed forensic accountant who could find a lie buried 4 layers deep in a spreadsheet before her coffee went cold. He just didn't remember that anymore, so he made a mistake. He talked business in front of me like I was furniture. The dinner was at the Cordelia, the boutique hotel. Derek had spent 3 years and $60 million building on the Charleston waterfront. It was 2 weeks from opening, and it was hemorrhaging money. Cost overruns, permit delays, a structural engineering bill that had tripled. Derek needed one thing to save it: a bridge loan from Ashworth Capital, a family investment office run by a woman named Grace Ashworth, who did not hand out money to men she didn't trust. 3 days before the dinner, Derek bought me a dress the color of good wine and told me exactly what my role would be. Look elegant, nod when spoken to. Don't mention my old job. Don't correct any numbers. Don't, under any circumstance, ask a question in front of Grace. Investors don't want a wife who thinks she's still relevant, he said. They want a wife who trusts her husband enough to stay quiet. I had heard some version of that sentence for 11 years, ever since I'd left Sterling and Cade, the forensic accounting firm where I'd once testified in federal fraud cases. Derek convinced me my license was a formality I didn't need anymore, that raising our son and managing his properties was a full-time job in itself. I let that argument win for over a decade. I never let my CFE credential lapse. I renewed it quietly every 2 years, told no one, kept a subscription to the same fraud examiner journals I'd read in my 20s. Derek never noticed. He never asked. The dinner started smooth. Grace Ashworth was sharp, unhurried, the kind of investor who let silence do her interrogating for her. Derek walked her through occupancy projections, debt service coverage, loan-to-value ratios, throwing numbers fast the way men do when they want you too dazzled to check the math. I sat there in the wine-colored dress, exactly the ornament I'd been told to be. Then Derek said the sentence that ended us. He leaned toward Grace, voice dropping into the easy, confiding tone men use when they think a subject has left the room even though she's sitting 3 feet away. Numbers can get restructured a little after closing. Nobody checks that closely once the wire clears. And don't worry about her signing anything, he said, nodding at me without looking at me. She just signs where I tell her to. Doesn't read a word of it. Grace's expression didn't move. Mine didn't either. But somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been sleeping for 11 years opened its eyes, because I had already caught it. The debt service coverage ratio he'd quoted didn't match the occupancy numbers he'd quoted 4 minutes earlier. Either the Cordelia's projected revenue was fabricated, or the loan application, already filed with Ashworth Capital, had numbers that didn't reconcile with what he'd just said out loud. Both were federal wire fraud if any of that money crossed state lines, which it would. I excused myself for the restroom, the same way any properly decorative wife might. My hands were steady. My mind was doing math it hadn't done in a very long time and remembered exactly how to do. In the stall, I called Priya Nazari. Priya had been my supervisor at Sterling and Cade, now a managing partner running her own forensic practice, and I'd learned 2 years ago through a mutual friend. I still quietly kept up with, currently, under contract doing due diligence, work for Ashworth Capital. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. She picked up on the second ring like no time had passed at all. I need you to tell me if Ashworth Capital is underwriting a hotel project called the Cordelia, I said. Silence. Then, that's not information I can just... My husband is developing it. He just told an investor the numbers can be quietly restructured after the wire clears, and that I sign whatever he hands me without reading it. I think the occupancy projections are fabricated. I think there's a structural issue he's hiding to make the closing deadline. Longer silence this time. Claire, is that you? Claire Whitfield? It's Mara now, I said. Whitfield's still my name until next week, apparently. Priya told me to go back to the table, stay calm, and say nothing. She was 3 blocks away, finishing a late dinner of her own. She could be there in 11 minutes. I fixed my lipstick, walked back into the dining room, and let Derek pour me more wine like nothing had happened. He was riding the high of a pitch he thought was landing. He mentioned, almost as an aside to Grace, that the fire marshal's final walk-through had been handled, that the sprinkler Retrofitting on the fourth floor was cosmetic paperwork at this point. I reached for my water glass and tipped it slightly, an excuse to bend toward my bag, where I'd already opened the voice memo app on my phone. 11 minutes later, the door opened, and Priya walked in with the Ashworth Capital's outside counsel a step behind her. "I believe I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, taking the empty seat beside Grace. I watched the color leave Derek's face in real time. Priya didn't accuse him of anything yet. She simply asked him in front of everyone to walk through the fire suppression certification for the 4th and 5th floors. Derek's answer wandered, vague, rehearsed, the kind of confident nonsense that had worked on rooms full of men for 15 years. It did not work on Priya. Grace set her fork down. "You said before dinner the sprinkler system passed inspection in full." "It's essentially passed," Derek said. "There's a technicality with 2 units. It's being resolved before we open." "2 units or the entire 4th floor," Priya said, "because the report I reviewed this afternoon says the 4th floor failed outright, and the version submitted to my firm for underwriting shows it passing." That was the moment I spoke for the first time all night. "There are 2 versions of that report," I said. "I found them on his home office desktop 3 weeks ago when I was looking for our son's insurance card. I didn't understand what I was looking at then. I understand it now." Derek turned to me like I'd grown a second head. "You don't know anything about fire code compliance." "No," I said, "but I know exactly what a falsified compliance document looks like when it's sitting next to the real one in the same folder. I used to build federal fraud cases out of smaller inconsistencies than that." Grace looked between us, recalculating everything in front of her. Ashworth Capital didn't kill the deal that night. Grace announced an immediate hold pending independent review of every document Derek's team had submitted. For a man used to closing deals on charm, a hold meant someone was finally going to look underneath the charm. It was worse than a rejection. A rejection could be argued with. An investigation could not. The car ride home was silent except for Derek's fury, low and simmering, the specific tone of a man rehearsing how he was going to spin this by morning. He told me I'd humiliated him in front of the most important investor of his career. I asked him what exactly had humiliated him. The fact that I understood the documents, or what the documents actually said. He didn't answer that. He pivoted the way he always did to fear dressed up as concern. If the deal collapsed, we could lose everything. Our son's college fund, the house, 15 years of building something together. Everything he'd built, he reminded me, was for our family. I told him I needed to think. He believed in that particular way men like Derek always believe, that he still had time to talk me back into agreement. That night, once his breathing settled, into the rhythm of a man who thought he'd already survived the worst of it, I sat in the bathroom with the blue light of my phone and pulled my credit report for the first time in years. 2 business loans, $900,000 combined, both listing me as personal guarantor. I had never signed either one. I made coffee the next morning like it was any other day, because the most dangerous thing I could do was let Derek see the version of me who'd spent half the night staring at debt with my name on it that I'd never agreed to. He watched me across the counter, searching for cracks. I gave him none. "I'll help however I can," I told him, stirring my coffee slowly. "But I need to understand what I'm actually agreeing to first." Relief moved through him so visibly it was almost sad to watch. He launched into an explanation, already smoothed at the edges. The loans were just a formality, standard practice for family businesses, nothing to worry about. I nodded, apologized for overreacting at dinner, and watched him relax completely into the story he needed to believe. The moment his car left the driveway, I called Priya, within 3 days. Working with a document examiner she trusted, we confirmed what I already suspected. My signature on both loan guarantees had been traced from a mortgage refinancing document we'd filed together 4 years earlier, copied down to the exact slant of my handwriting. Buried in the same file was a $2 million life insurance policy on my life, purchased 8 months ago, with Derek listed as sole beneficiary right around the time the loans had first appeared. Priya was careful not to let me spiral over the policy alone. Plenty of people insure a spouse for reasons that mean nothing, but stacked next to forged signatures, a fabricated fire safety report, and $900,000 of debt quietly built in my name. It stopped looking like nothing. We spent the next week building the case the right way. A forensic document examiner confirmed the forgeries formally. A structural engineer Priya brought in independently confirmed the 4th floor sprinkler system had in fact failed inspection, and that occupying the building without the retrofit put actual guests at risk of exactly the kind of fire failure the fabricated report was built to hide. And buried 3 subcontractors deep in the payment records was a shell vendor called Low Country Compliance Partners, registered to a P.O. box Derek had opened 4 months earlier, quietly siphoning off inspection remediation, funds that were never spent on remediation. I met with Grace Ashworth privately, without Derek's knowledge, and laid every piece of it on the table. She listened without interrupting once, the way people listen when they're deciding exactly how much they've already been lied to. 2 days later, Derek came home with a folder and a colleague I didn't recognize, a junior associate named Ben who kept clicking his pen like it might save him. They slid a letter across our dining table stating that I had known about and consented to the loan guarantees, that my objections at dinner had simply been a misunderstanding, that signing this letter would resolve everything quietly. I asked for a moment to get my reading glasses, carried the papers into the next room, photographed every page, and sent them straight to Priya before folding them back exactly as they'd been. I told Derek I wanted my own attorney to review it before I signed anything. His jaw tightened, but with Ben sitting there, he couldn't push the way he wanted to. That gave me the window I needed. I texted Derek 2 days later, telling him I was ready to talk about signing, that I wanted to understand exactly how I'd be protected if the deal collapsed. He suggested the hotel bar. I redirected him to a small conference room at Priya's firm instead, framed as more private. A room with a clearly posted notice by the door that all sessions could be recorded, booked under a name he wouldn't recognize. He believed, walking in, that his wife had finally come around. I let my voice shake a little when I mentioned our son, the house, what it would mean to start over. Derek softened into the tone he always used when he thought he had the upper hand. Patient, a little condescending, almost gentle. He explained that the loans were just a formality, that banks preferred a family name on paper, that he'd signed for me, because I always signed whatever he handed me anyway. And if the deal falls apart, I asked, I'm the one who owes $900,000? Only if it fails, he said. And it won't, as long as you don't make this harder than it needs to be. I asked what exactly my part in that was supposed to look like. He told me, almost bored, that Grace needed to see he'd do whatever it took to protect her investment, that the fire report would only need to hold up long enough for the wire to clear, that they'd fix the sprinkler system quietly afterward and nobody would ever know it had failed in the first place. Guests staying on the 4th floor in the meantime, he said, were an acceptable risk for 2 weeks. I asked if he understood what he'd just admitted to. He laughed, told me not to turn this into a moral conversation, said this was $60 million, sitting on the table, and I was choosing this moment to develop a conscience. That sentence told me everything I'd always suspected and never had proof of. To Derek, I had always been worth less than the number on a contract. He noticed the recording notice by the door about 4 seconds too late. I watched the blood leave his face exactly the way it had at the Cordelia. He stood, demanded my phone. I didn't move. Priya walked in with building security a step behind her and told him, calmly, that he was not permitted to approach me and that Ashworth Capital's counsel had already been notified of suspected forgery and fraud. He pivoted straight to threats, that I was about to destroy our son's future, that nobody would believe me over him. You already put his future on debt he doesn't know exists, I told him. I'm just stopping you from finishing the job. The closing meeting for the Cordelia deal happened 8 days later. Derek believed it was still a signing ceremony. He had no idea it had become a hearing. He walked in wearing his best suit, rehearsing his line about family legacy and hospitality with pride. Grace sat at the head of the table with Ashworth's general counsel, a structural engineer, and Priya. I waited in an adjoining room until I was called. Derek opened with growth projections and talk of trust, the same performance that had worked on rooms full of people for 15 years. When counsel asked to confirm the fire safety documentation, Derek said it was fully resolved. That was my moment. I walked in and said, I had personally seen both versions of that report sitting in the same folder, and that the guarantee documents bearing my signature had never been signed by me. Derek recovered fast, told the room I was upset over marital issues, that this had nothing to do with the deal. Priya stepped forward with the folder we'd built, the forensic handwriting analysis, the fabricated report side by side with the real one, the wire transfers to the shell vendor, my credit report showing loans I never agreed to, page after page laid out with the calm precision of someone who had built cases like this for a living, because she had. Derek turned on Ben, who insisted he'd only been following instructions. Grace looked at Derek and asked, very simply, whether he understood that occupying that building, in its current condition, could have gotten someone killed. He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that didn't end his career on the spot. Ashworth Capital withdrew from the deal entirely that morning and forwarded the full file to state regulators and the fire marshal's office. Derek's composure finally broke. He started pleading that I'd misunderstood, that everything he'd done was for our family, that hundreds of contractors would lose work without the deal. You didn't build this for our family, I told him. You used our family as collateral. Security escorted him out of the building he'd spent 3 years building. Ben was suspended before the door closed behind them. In the months that followed, Derek was formally investigated for loan fraud, forged financial instruments, and falsifying safety documentation tied to public occupancy. The forensic handwriting review cleared me of every guarantee filed under my name. The banks froze the loans pending the fraud finding. Low Country Compliance Partners was dissolved and its funds traced and clawed back. Ashworth Capital walked away from the Cordelia, but Grace stayed close enough afterward to help me understand what rebuilding a career after 11 years away actually looked like, because 2 months later, she was the one who offered me a contract role on her own due diligence team. I filed for divorce the same week the investigation opened, with a restraining order that kept Derek out of the house and away from our accounts while discovery moved forward. He tried, predictably, to make our son see the divorce as something I'd done to the family. I didn't hand our son every ugly detail. I told him only what a 15-year-old needed to carry, that his father had made dangerous decisions with other people's safety and our family's future, and that staying quiet about it wasn't the same thing as protecting anyone. I sold the house once the settlement cleared. It had never really felt like mine. Every room decorated to impress people. Derek wanted something from. I moved into a smaller place near my son's school and slowly, methodically, rebuilt a credit history and a professional license. I'd quietly kept alive without ever admitting, even to myself, why I never let it lapse. A few months after the hearing, Derek asked to meet to finalize the settlement. He looked smaller across that table than I remembered, something hollow where the confidence used to sit. He asked if I'd ever actually trust anyone again. I told him I already did. I trusted the version of myself I'd spent 11 years quietly keeping alive without his permission. Sometimes I think about that dinner at the Cordelia, the exact sentence that ended my marriage before either of us said the word divorce out loud. It wasn't the filing. It wasn't the hearing. It was a man at a table full of investors, so certain his wife had stopped paying attention that he told the truth by accident. I didn't beg. I didn't make a scene. I listened, and for the first time in over a decade, I trusted what I heard more than I trusted his explanation for it. What would you have done sitting at that table, confronted him on the spot, or waited the way I did until the proof couldn't be argued with? Tell me in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If Mara's story gave you something to sit with, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.